England's system of £9,000 tuition fees has come under intense political pressure following the election. Labour is widely regarded as having scored a significant impact with voters, particularly young ones, with its pledge to abolish tuition fees. According to recent newspaper front pages, this has prompted Theresa May to ask her head of policy to examine potential changes to the system. With a political storm underway, can the tuition fee system survive? And does it deserve to survive? Joining us to discuss these questions is Conservative peer David Willetts, architect of the £9,000 fees system as Universities and Science Minister, whose new book, A University Education, will be published in November. And with him is Lord Adonis, a former Education Minister in the Labour government, who, as head of the No. 10 policy unit under Tony Blair, was an architect of the £3,000 tuition fees system introduced alongside public funding by Labour in 2006. And Andrew is also a member of the House of Lords who's been described by The Guardian as a one-man tuition fee Twitter storm, bringing even greater media focus onto what he describes as a tuition fees cartel operated by universities and what he sees as the greed of vice-chancellors in their salaries. So Andrew, starting with you, you've written that fees of £9,250, as they will be from this autumn, are so politically diseased they should be abolished entirely. And as someone who was a key force in introducing Labour's system of tuition fees, what's converted you to that view?
Well, there's a category difference between fees of £3,000 with no real rate of interest, which is what was introduced in 2004, and £9,250 with 6.1% interest. And my view is that the £9,250 at 6.1% interest won't survive. So one of two things will happen. Either the vice-chancellors take the lead in cutting them, which is what I would do if I were them, because I think then it might be possible to create a consensus for a much smaller figure. And if I were them, because dynamic is what matters in policy and politics, is I'd be cutting them by about £1,000 a year for the next few years, so to diffuse the sense of a crisis over the system, to create a growing sense of fairness, and to get students on their side. And if they do that, I think they might be able to neutralise the growing political backlash against fees. If they don't do that, I think what will happen, as is happening in the United States at the moment, with states abolishing fees, and has happened across continental Europe, and may well happen in New Zealand too, is the politicians will abolish them. Now, I personally hope that we can keep some level of fees. I think that 3,000 to 4,000 was about right, so you have co-payment between the state and the individual. And if there could be a political consensus, as there was before 2010, behind that system, that I think would be preferable. But I think the ball is now very much in the court of the universities themselves. And if they take a lead and start cutting the fees, I think they may survive. If they don't, then I think it's only a matter of time before they go.
And David, Andrew's talked about what he sees as pretty big flaws in the system you created there. And if we believe the newspaper reports, the government's considering changes to the student loans or fees system in a bid to win younger voters. £9,000 fees are a pretty big political problem for the government, aren't they?
Well, I would say, first of all, what Andrew is proposing would be a dereliction of responsibility by universities. This is the money that pays for the education of students. It's like saying a head teacher should reduce the amount of grant they receive for the education of their pupils by £1,000 a year. This is what ensures that seminars aren't crowded, that there's new kit in the laboratories. So it would be appalling if we reduce the money behind students for education. The reason why we have this system is because over decades, when universities were dependent on public spending, they lost out. They lost out to more politically popular causes, be it the health service or earlier stages of education. And I just think that that is too big a risk for universities to bear. Of course, there should be public spending alongside the graduate repayment scheme. And there is. It comes in several forms. It's everything from funding for high-cost subjects through, quite rightly, meeting the costs of those graduates who don't earn enough to pay back, which is a very progressive way. So there's a mix of public and private spend. But the fundamental principle that graduates, if they're in well-paid jobs, repay is the right principle. Of course, you can, within that, adjust the system. And I have in the past said I thought every parliament there should be a review where you can not tear the whole thing up and start again, but you can absolutely look at anything from the repayment threshold, the interest rate, the cash available for students. All that is part of the day-to-day, year-to-year business of managing a higher education system, but within the framework of graduate repayment.
And the IFS report recently made some pretty damning criticisms of the abolition of maintenance grants and decision to retrospectively freeze the repayment threshold. Those things happened after you left government, but presumably you'd agree those were incorrect decisions?
Well, I think there is an issue about graduates from lower income backgrounds leaving university with more debt than graduates from more affluent backgrounds. I understand that issue. I think on the repayment threshold, I don't agree that that was, quote, retrospective. That is absolutely the way in which the system adjusts. Nobody envisaged when we set the £21,000 repayment threshold that we had then determined it for the next 30 years. That's absolutely where, in the light of social, political judgments, people can uprate the repayment threshold, reduce the repayment threshold.
Although there was a pledge at the time that it would go up in line with earnings.
Yes, but what happened was, of course, the 21,000 threshold, which was always very generous, ended up being even more generous because earnings didn't grow as much as was forecast. But look, that's a relatively second-order point. All these things are adjustable. Where I disagree with Andrew is I actually think the framework is a good framework for students and universities. It ensures they have a well-funded education and without number controls. And if we bring back public expenditure on the scale that Andrew wants it, we'll have number controls back. And as we have number controls back, it'll be the people from the most disadvantaged backgrounds who lose out. And we'll end up, paradoxically, because I actually agree with Andrew about the importance of competition, we'll end up with less competition because the way in which you deliver number controls is you allocate to each university a number of places. That was the old system we inherited, and it's a great prize that we don't do that, and that's actually where the competition is to be found. They're competing for students now.
We'll have numbers controls back anyway. It's only a matter of time, and I think a short period of time, because the one thing that is absolutely not surviving the system is 6.1% interest. I mean, that is so politically toxic that I can't see that Conservative MPs would be prepared to go into the next election for that. Now, bringing the 6.1% interest down to RPI interest is £3 billion a year, because of course the interest rate applies to the generality of student loans, including the maintenance loans, not just the fee loans. So it's a hugely expensive reform. Now, the Treasury, because the only reason that they agreed to David's request to lift the cap on numbers was to have a substantial rate of interest, real rate of interest as part of the deal. In return for scrapping that real rate of interest, they will absolutely go back to numbers controls. So that'll happen either next year or the year after, whenever the interest rate comes down.
This is incorrect from every point of view. First of all, the figures involved in the interest rate are nothing like what Andrew said.
No, they are.
And I can also, as a matter of history, say that it's nor is his explanation as to how we got it. It brought in actually to collect more money from more affluent graduates. It was brought as a progressive measure, but it's not a fundamental feature of the system.
It is £3 billion a year, because it applies to it's 3 percentage points of interest on the whole generality of the student loan book, not just on the fee loans. So that's going to happen anyway. In terms of David's points about the this being a dereliction of duty, the university has made a huge windfall out of fees. All the modelling on fees was done on the basis that they would be 6,000 and only exceptionally go up to 9,000. David said that in the House of Commons, as did Vince Cable at the time. In fact, what happened is that every university went up to 9,000 and now £9,250 for the entirety of their courses. So they made a very big windfall. Universities are also extremely inefficient. They barely use their plant for 4 months of the year. David, when he was minister, made no progress at all in getting them to introduce 2-year degrees, which should have happened a long time ago and could enable the costs to come down substantially. It's not just vice-chancellors who are overpaid, but the senior management teams in universities are bloated and massively overpaid. And if you cut that back by about half, which is what would happen in any other efficient public sector organisation, and reduce the salary bill, in each institution that would give you between 5 and 10 million to play with. So my own view is that you could cut the fees substantially without affecting the quality of education. The problem for David is that he wasn't minister for the universities, he was basically minister of the universities. Everything he wanted they wanted him to do, he did. And that's the reason I think partly why we're in this mess at the moment.
Can I just come back to...
Now, hang on, that was a very long list from Andrew. And I'm not going to have time to correct all of the points. This argument about the windfall. It wasn't a windfall. What has happened...
It was a real substantial gain.
What happened is, compared with the other stages of education, as we know, for decades, resource per student fell. When Andrew brought in the 3K fees, what he did is he stopped the decline. But it remained the case that the resource per student had fallen when for other stages of education it had increased. This was extra money to reverse a decline. It didn't even bring the real resource per student back up to the levels of the 1970s.
Which have been vastly
And
bloated.
of that 9,000,
Which have been vastly
1,000 goes on access programmes. Some of it goes to fund the borrowing that is necessary as the capital programmes were lost. It was a modest reversal of a long-term
It's about
decline of
20%
funding per
meaningful.
student,
It's about
from which
20%
and
meaningful.
students had lost out as a result of that reversal of that. And the idea that vice-chancellors' salaries, the idea that somehow the money you save on that is anything like matching the scale of the loss of funding which Andrew is proposing. No,
It's the whole management
The
tier.
people there's
David, you
one group
shouldn't
of
get your-
losers from this, and that is it's going to be students.
You shouldn't get yourself into the position, David, of defending every vested interest inside the universities.
well, defending
because
students. I'm
because
defending
you're not
students.
defending students themselves don't want to be paying £9,250 fees, I can assure you.
It's a graduate payment scheme. They
If
don't
I can
have.
interrupt just for a moment, in that context, one of the key points you've raised is about what you've called the cartel among universities.
There's a manifesto
of all-
cartel.
Of the reason why institutions all charge the £9,000 maximum. You're blaming universities, but isn't one of the key points that the nature of income contingent loans means there will never be any so-called price
no.
competition?
No, it's-
if there is a fault, it's with the policy design of the system.
No, the
It
fault-
wasn't universities' fault, they were behaving rationally.
Well, you can have a debate about whether or not the universities engaged in a cartel. My own view is that they did, because, I mean, we all know how the universities work. They all meet in UK the whole time. They exchange notes all the time. A whole lot of private conversations
Cartel's
took place.
quite a serious
But
word
it's
to use.
what happened. I mean, they're all discussing all the time what they're going to do with fees. However, the issue is, once it became clear when fees went up to 9,000, that despite the assurances which David gave to Parliament at the time, that there weren't going to be fees which were substantially lower than £9,000 at any institution. What should then have happened is that the government should have intervened. If I'd been minister doing David's job, I would have intervened and required fees to be lower in respect of courses which were lower value and in respect of courses which are a higher cost, which is precisely what happens in Australia. And actually our system was mirrored in Australia. And my original intention in 2004 was we would introduce a system very similar to Australia's with 3 tiers of fees.
Right. 2 comments on that.
So,
Hang on,
but the
again,
state failed to do it. That's the reason why we have universal fees of
Let us just correct
£9,250.
2 of the points. There isn't time to correct all of them. Let me just correct 2 of these points. First of all, in terms of the cartel, no, as you implied in your question, it's because the repayment terms are so generous and because, quite rightly, students don't pay up front, that the distinction between 7,500 or 8,500 is not what matters. What matters for a student is having a well-funded, properly delivered education. The competition, which is now intense, is because we don't have the system Andrew wants. We're able to get rid of number controls, as a result of which universities are competing for students, and they're competing on the quality of their offer, because now some universities are gaining students and others are losing them. That's how we get the competition.
But
and
why-
also, and then when he wants these low-value courses, and I've now had quite a few of these debates with Andrew last week. I know what he means
Why
by
should
low-value
people-
courses. He means courses at less prestigious universities, whereas if this was secondary education we'd be talking about, he'd be proudly calling for a pupil premium.
Yes, paid
To
by the
help-
state,
to
not
help-
paid by the
No,
not paid by the
but
graduates.
what he
There's
wants
a big
to do-
difference
no,
between those two.
what we have, the reason, one of the many reasons for having even fees is precisely so that there's proper resource behind students who are at less prestigious universities, often from more disadvantaged backgrounds. If those graduates don't earn so much, then quite rightly, the generality of taxpayers don't collect the money off them. That is the best way of achieving the objective, which actually Andrew and I have in common.
But I think
Far
we need-
better to do it by
yeah.
helping at the graduate level than trying to predict through some sort of micro controls which are the courses
But
you
I
want
think-
to
I
fund.
think
Do
we
it
need-
through helping graduates.
But we need to be clear. If David had said, what David now says is the best of all possible worlds to have all universities charging £9,250 for all courses. If he had said that to the House of Commons in 2012, his reform would not have passed. His reform only passed because of the assurances that he gave to Parliament that fees would be related to the value to the graduates, that they would not all go up to £9,250. He said that it would only be exceptional was his word, for universities to charge more than £6,000 in respect of any course. And it was on that basis that very reluctantly he managed to dragoon Parliament into voting for this reform. If he'd been honest about what he was doing, this reform would not have
No, I
gone
don't
through
accept
and we
that.
wouldn't be in this
I don't-
mess
I don't accept
at
that.
the
What I
moment.
do accept is this. What I do accept is that
It is true that you did.
Yeah, and let me
you wanted
issue-
price
let me
competition
issue my
when-
mea culpa, 'cause
when
there
you were
is
speaking
something.
in the
There is
Commons in
something.
2010.
Indeed, there is something. And that is, for 10 years, The model had been price competition. I inherited a way of thinking where price competition is what we're after. Andrew is still after price competition. It is absolutely true that in the summer of 2010, I was expecting price competition. By early 2011, but I fully accept the responsibility of what I said in the comment, I realised that given what we had ended up with as the repayment system, there wouldn't be price competition, and I increasingly think that the pursuit of price competition is not the right form of price competition in universities. What we have got is competition in a different form, which we introduce subsequently on numbers. That's the way to get the competition. But I fully accept my responsibility. I thought there would be divergence of fees. There wasn't, but I understand why there wasn't.
If we can move on to a final question about the future. It does seem as if Labour has changed the terms of the debate with Jeremy Corbyn's pledge to abolish fees. How do you think the funding situation will pan out in the short to medium term? What's going to happen next?
I think it crucially depends upon whether vice-chancellors who are paid these vast salaries, whether they do their job and lead, or whether they have the leadership done for them. If they lead, I think they can maintain some level of fees, and they can have better funded institutions. If they fail to lead, and they haven't been very good at leading this debate, indeed they've gone into hiding, essentially, because they're not prepared to justify their salaries. If they fail to lead, then a minister who is less the servant of the universities than David was will actually do a reform to them, and that reform, I think, will be the wholesale removal of the current fees and loan system, as is happening across the developed world, and will be back into universities regarded, I think, maybe correctly, as public services and not as quasi-businesses which are ripping off students.
That would be a terrible future for higher education. I was, of course, the servant of students, and proud to be the servant of students, and I think this system works in the better interests of students than the system in the past. It means they have a better funded education and a very progressive repayment. Of course, you can look at the repayment terms, and we all see the issues that are around on, for example, interest rates. But that is different from trying to tear the whole structure down. I think there is actually a challenge for Labour, and I speak now as chairing a think tank, Resolution Foundation, that focuses on people with lower living standards. At the last election, Corbyn was willing to spend £11 billion a year helping graduates, many of them in well-paid jobs, certainly on average earning more than non-graduates. He was not willing to commit to anything other than a price freeze on the tax credits, which hold down the incomes of low-income working families. The irony of where Corbyn is taking the Labour Party, it is one of the most regressive party manifestos I have seen. He's focusing on graduates. He's not got much to offer on the NHS. He's not offering anything on tax credits. This is a guy who actually needs to, when he starts confronting the question of what are the priorities for the use of public spending, which is the crucial political decision, he can say he wants to spend more, but spending more on this as a political priority would be, I think, a very peculiar decision again, and not socially progressive.
I greatly respect David, but from the last,
that's always a bad start.
From a minister in the last Conservative government to have these crocodile tears about the fate of the poor, I don't think really works. The fact of the matter is the system is grossly unfair at the moment, the university finance system. It is indeed, he is right, it is indeed a substitute for some element of public spending, but the thing to do is to cut the element of spending that is excessive at the moment, which is considerable, return that to the students, and they get more of a sense of
students
balance
don't pay.
and fairness.
No, you're cutting the resource available to
the,
students in order to reduce repayments by graduates, and that is really regressive, and they lose the quality of the education, and it's the most affluent graduates who gain the most. It's not progressive in any sense.
Unfortunately, we have to leave things there. We've gained some extremely well-informed insights into how we came to get here and what the future might hold. Thank you both very much for joining us.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Andrew.